This morning we are starting a new series of messages. We've just finished up with Easter. We've celebrated the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But now we have to change gears a little bit. And we're going to be talking about dealing with things that we really shouldn't have to deal with. Dealing with troubles and heartaches and difficulties that come our way through no fault of our own. And so this morning's message is titled, How Do We Respond? And we're going to be focusing on the beginning of Joseph's story in the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 37. This is the first in our series, Tough Questions, When Easy Answers Don't Cut It. Now, I have to ask you this question. Why does tragedy strike? And when it happens, do we question God? Most of us have done that. We need to listen and to watch as Bob Russell tells a personal story of wrestling with that very question.
I remember the first time I ever seriously asked the question. My home church was celebrating its homecoming Sunday. And I was in my mid-20s, had participated in the worship service that morning. But that afternoon at the church picnic, our popular preacher drowned in the old swimming hole. It was horrible. The whole church was there. The preacher's wife and his two children, even his dad, watched in horror when his body was dragged ashore. Everybody prayed for his recovery, but all attempts at resuscitation were unsuccessful. People were sobbing and screaming. But there was one family member who wasn't there. Greg, his 14-year-old son, had stayed home that day with the flu. A half hour later, a friend of the family and I drove up to the house to tell Greg what had happened. Now, how do you tell a 14-year-old boy that his dad, his hero, is gone? It was one of the most difficult things I ever had to do. I felt really terrible for him. That's when I kept asking the question, where was God? Why would God let this happen? Why would God let Gerald Kump drown? I didn't have the answer. I didn't understand it.
Have you been there? Something happens that you just can't explain. It either happens to you, or it happens to a loved one, or it happens in a community. How do we explain why these things occur? And how do we explain that somehow God doesn't seem to care and that He wasn't there to stop it? A moment of crisis can change everything. Tragedy, often undeserved, can send us reeling. It can even make us question the belief that a good and caring God even watches over us. And the Old Testament character Joseph went through a series of tragedies in his young life and dealt with unexpected pain throughout his life. And yet Joseph remained faithful to God. Now, as we begin this 5 or 6 weeks of study on the life of Joseph and on his sufferings, let's understand that in His timing, God acts for our ultimate good. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 37. If you look at the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, you'll find that the story of Joseph starts in Genesis 37 and goes all the way to the end of the book of Genesis. There's more time spent on Joseph's life in the book of Genesis than on any other Bible character. And there's a lot for us to learn. First of all, let's understand that suffering is inevitable, but misery is optional. Look at Genesis chapter 37, and this is where we pick up on the story of Joseph. Joseph had been born, and so there's this little summation. And then we start finding out how dysfunctional. Genesis 37, I'm going to be looking first of all at verses 1 through 11. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan, And this is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, and his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel, or Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made a richly ornamented robe, or, as we would know it, a coat of many colors for him. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while all your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. You know, we are going to suffer in life, and that is inevitable, but it's up to us as to how we deal with it. Joseph was born into a dysfunctional family. He entered the world with a few strikes against him already. His father, Jacob, had lied and cheated to get where he was. Now let's review a little bit about what was going on up to the time that Joseph had these dreams. Jacob, his father, had caught his brother Esau at a susceptible time in his life, and he bargained for the greater family inheritance. Esau was famished after hunting, and Jacob fixed a pot of stew, and Esau traded his inheritance, the greater inheritance of the family, just for a pot of stew. Later, with his mother's help, Jacob tricked his father into giving him the family blessing that was supposed to go to the oldest son. The blessing, the patriarchal blessing, that was supposed to be handed off to Esau. And Esau, finding out about it, vowed to kill Jacob, And from that time on, Jacob had to live like a fugitive. And so he ran away, but he didn't run too far. He ran to family. He went to his uncle Laban's, and there he fell in love with his cousin Rachel. He agreed to work for Laban for 7 years to earn the right to marry Rachel. But at the end of 7 years, Jacob was tricked, and he wound up married to Rachel's older sister, Leah. Well, Jacob still loved Rachel, and so he worked it out with Laban to work an additional 7 years in order to also marry Rachel. Now, Jacob, later in his life, had become a godly man, but the dysfunction in the family continued. Because of jealousy between these two sisters, each of them gave Jacob their servants as wives. And so ultimately, Jacob had 4 wives, 12 sons, and many daughters. And Genesis 37 tells us that because Joseph was the first child out of Rachel's womb, the one wife, the one woman he loved with all his heart, Joseph became the favored child. Now, there was already plenty of friction between the 10 older brothers before Joseph ever entered the picture. And Jacob, doting on Joseph, did not help. It was a tough situation. It was a tough family to grow up in. It didn't help either that Joseph had these dreams. And when Joseph retells his dreams to his brothers, they understand it to mean that Joseph will reign over them one day, And when they heard it, we're told that these half-brothers hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Sometimes we can't control our circumstances. Sometimes we will suffer due to no fault of our own. But even in those situations, we can control our attitudes. We can bloom where we're planted. How many remember or maybe have a couple copies of Chicken Soup for the Soul? Remember that title? It's a book of encouraging stories about how we can overcome things, how we can have a better attitude in life. And this is one story from one of the volumes. Jerry was the manager of a restaurant. He was always in a good mood. He always had something positive to say. And when someone would ask Jerry about how he was doing, he would always reply, "If I were any better, I'd have to be twins." Well, he was so admired by his employees that when Jerry changed jobs, many of the wait staff, the waiters and waitresses, also changed jobs so they could still work with Jerry. He was an encourager to them. If anyone was having a bad day, Jerry would always be there telling that employee how to look at the positive side of whatever situation they were facing. He was once asked, "I don't get it. No one can be positive at all the time. How in the world do you do it?" And Jerry replied, "Every morning I wake up and say to myself, I have two choices today. I can choose to be in a good mood, or I can choose to be in a bad mood. And I always choose to be in a good mood. And each time something bad happens, I can choose to be a victim, or I can choose to learn from it. I always choose to learn from it." Several years later, Jerry walked into the restaurant through an unlocked door and encountered a thief. Someone was trying to rob the restaurant. They pulled a gun on him, and they demanded that he open the safe. And when Jerry fumbled out of nervousness with the combination, the robber shot him. People found him in the nick of time, and they rushed him to the hospital, and he was still conscious when he arrived. The paramedics, he said, were great. They kept telling me that I was going to be fine. But when they wheeled me into the emergency room, I saw the expression on the faces of the doctors and the nurses, and I really got scared. Because the expression on their faces was saying simply, "He's a dead man." And I knew I needed to take action. Well, there was this big nurse who was shouting questions at me, trying to keep me awake. And she asked me if I was allergic to anything. And I took the best breath I could, and I said, "Yes." And the emergency room got quiet. All of the attendants, all the doctors and nurses stopped to listen to what he was going to say. And she said, "What is it you're allergic to?" And he took a deep breath, and as loud as he could yell, he said, "Bullets!" Well, that changed the attitude, and that changed the atmosphere. And Jerry pulled through. He lived the rest of his life with bullet fragments in his body. But he said over their laughter, "I am choosing to live. Please operate on me. I'm still alive. I'm not dead yet." And Jerry's amazing attitude pulled him through. You know, our amazing attitudes and our understanding of what God's will in our lives can pull us through whatever catastrophe, whatever tragedy we might be facing. We can choose to be joyful, or we can choose to be miserable. Suffering is inevitable. Misery is optional. Secondly, let's understand, because explanations are rare, we need to be willing to trust and wait. Let's look at the rest of the story as we find in Genesis 37. We're picking up at verse 12, and we're reading through verse 37. It says, "Now his brothers had gone to graze their father's flocks near Shechem, and Israel, or Jacob, had said to Joseph, 'As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I am going to send you to them.' 'Very well,' he replied. So he said to him, 'Go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me.' And then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around the fields, and he asked him, "What are you looking for?" And Joseph replied, "I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks?" "Well, they have moved on from here," the man answered. "I heard them say, 'Let's go to Dothan.'" And so Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But when they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. "Here comes that dreamer," they said to each other. "Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. And then we'll see what comes of his dreams." When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue Joseph from their hands. "Let's not take his life," he said. "Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the desert, but don't lay a hand on him." Reuben said this, intending to rescue him from them and take him back to their father. So when Joseph came to the brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the richly ornamented robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. Now the cistern was empty because it was dry and there was no water in it. And as they sat down to eat their meal, they looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. The camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. Judah said to his brothers, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." And so the brothers agreed. And so when the Midianite merchants came, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. He went back to his brothers and said, "The boy isn't there. Where can I turn now?" And then they got Joseph's robe. They slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornamented robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." He recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." And when Jacob tore his own clothes, he put sackcloth on and mourned for his son for many days. All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "in mourning I will go down to the grave to my son." And so his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Potiphar's officials, the captain of the guard. Now, Bob Russell said this in this series. He said, "If you have never had your faith shaken by unexplainable suffering, be thankful, but also be prepared, because your time will come." There is not one single purposeful flaw mentioned about Joseph in any part of the Scriptures. Not only in the story we have here in Genesis, but later when Joseph is referred to in the Old Testament, when he is referred to in the New Testament, no one points out any flaws. And that's quite unusual. That's rare for the Scriptures, because the Scriptures paint the truth, and they paint people as they are. My flaws would have been exposed if I was there in biblical times and they wrote about me, and yours would have too. But Joseph really didn't have very many flaws at all, and nothing that was mentioned in the Scriptures. And so here's a thumbnail sketch of the rest of Joseph's life. We looked at what brought Joseph into the predicament he was in, and now I want to look at where Joseph went from there. The Midianites sold Joseph to Potiphar in Egypt. Now, Potiphar was Pharaoh's captain of the royal guard. That means basically he was general of the Pharaoh's army. He was in charge. In order to achieve that high a position, Potiphar had to be strict and he had to be ruthless. Now, if you were going to be auctioned off as a slave, wouldn't you prefer to be sold to someone who might be gentle and kind, someone like a musician or a florist, instead of to the commander of Pharaoh's army? But no, Joseph found himself being sold as a slave to the one in charge of Pharaoh's army, Pharaoh's guard. At 17 years old, he found himself in a very helpless situation. These customs weren't their customs. This wasn't a language he spoke. He had been doted on by his father, and now he was sleeping on rock-hard ground. But he proved trustworthy and loyal. And in a very short period of time, Potiphar placed Joseph in charge of his whole household. It wasn't only Potiphar who had noticed Joseph, but it was also Potiphar's wife. And she tried to seduce him. When Joseph resisted her moves, she got angry and she accused Joseph of attempting to rape her. And Potiphar threw Joseph into prison. While Joseph was in prison, he encountered different people who had been having some dreams, and he was able to interpret those dreams. Two of those people happened to be very close to Pharaoh himself. One was Pharaoh's cupbearer. That means that he prepared the wines that Pharaoh would drink, and he would actually sample them to be sure there was no poison in them and to verify that it was safe for Pharaoh to drink. The other was Pharaoh's baker. These two men were thrown into prison. We're not sure why, but nonetheless, here they were. They both angered Pharaoh to some point, or he was suspicious of them. And they had had some dreams. And Joseph interpreted the dreams of these two workers for Pharaoh. When he correctly interpreted the dreams, he told the cupbearer, who he said would be able to serve Pharaoh again, he said, when you get out and when you go to Pharaoh, tell him about me. And the cupbearer said, oh, I sure will. You know, if he were in the UP, he'd say, you betcha, by golly, I would. You know, he would just say, you know, whatever it takes, I'm so glad what you said's true. Well, the cupbearer went on with his business, went on with his life, and he completely forgot about Joseph. 2 years transpired. And in those 2 years, we find that Pharaoh himself had some disturbing dreams. And none of Pharaoh's officials, none of his wise counsel could interpret those dreams for Pharaoh. And then it's like the light went on in the cupbearer's mind, and he said, oh yeah, that young Hebrew man, Joseph. And he went to Pharaoh and he said, while I was in prison, he correctly interpreted the dreams of both the baker and of myself, and what he said came to be. He might be able to interpret yours. And so Pharaoh immediately had Joseph out of the prison, had him there in his court, and Pharaoh explained to Joseph what had happened and what the dreams were, and Joseph said this, here's the deal, here's what I sense from God. God is the interpreter of dreams, not me. And he said this very simply. He said, there are going to be 7 years of plenty, and we are going to have bumper crops in all of Egypt. And then there's going to be 7 years of extreme famine, and it's not just going to happen to us, but it's going to happen to this whole part of the world. Pharaoh was upset about that. The 7 years of plenty sounded great, but 7 years of famine? What do we do about that? And the question was asked, and Joseph said, here's my recommendation. During our 7 years of plenty, let's build storage bins, huge storage bins, and let's put that surplus crop and all those grains in those bins. Let's keep it dry and safe and good to use so that when the famine comes, we will not only have food for ourselves, but we can feed our neighboring countries around us. And that appealed to Pharaoh so much that he sent Joseph out to do the work. And Joseph proved himself again and eventually became second in command in all of Egypt. Now, this all happened so that Joseph could be reunited with his brothers. When the famine hit Egypt, it also hit the land of Canaan, or Israel, and they were out of food. And it was Jacob who said to the 10 older sons, I understand there's grain in Egypt. Here's money. You go to Egypt and bring back the grain for our family and for our servants. And then we have the whole reveal that took place. They didn't recognize Joseph because Joseph was second in command of all of Egypt. Joseph talked like an Egyptian. He walked like an Egyptian. He was dressed like an Egyptian. And they were so fearful when they found out this was their brother. And yet Joseph handled it well. So let's pick up the story. The end of the story, we're skipping down through a number of the different things that happened in Joseph's life, because I want to talk about how do we deal with these bad things that happen to us, and with the people sometimes that cause these bad things to happen to us. There had been some reunion, and let him come in and live with us. The sons of Jacob, and all of Jacob died. Now that Dad is still in their head, if the shoes were reversed. And so we pick up in verse 15 of chapter 50. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" And so they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died." We're not told that the father did, but they said this anyway. "This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of God, of your father." And when their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves." You know what that sounds like? That sounds like 11 sheaves bowing to one. That sounds like all the sun, the moon, and 11 stars bowing to one. It had come true. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children, and be reassured." And he reassured them, and he spoke kindly to them. So here at the end of Genesis, after Jacob's death, we see reconciliation. We see a man who could have easily, with the power he could control, he could have wiped out these 11, and some people would have said, "That's right, that's just," and they got what they deserved for being so mean and so cruel to you when you were a young man. But instead he said, "No, if it hadn't happened, how many lives would have died in this famine? If it hadn't happened, how could I save my family?" It reflects so much on what we see our Lord Jesus doing, when he could have gotten back at us for our sins. In 1 Peter chapter 2, Peter says this. He says, we need to look to the Lord Jesus, who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree or on the cross, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. What Joseph said to his brothers in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, is amazing. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it to be for good, to accomplish what is being done now, the saving of many lives." You see, sometimes hardship, difficulties, unexplained circumstances can pay off if we have the right heart, if we have the right attitude. We have the benefit of jumping to Genesis chapter 50 and seeing, "And they lived happily ever after." Joseph didn't have that benefit. While he was being neglected and forgotten in a prison, He certainly had to wonder, is this what my life is, God? Is this all that's left? No. We need to understand that God works all things together for good to those who love him, those who are called according to his purpose. And so we need to trust God's sovereign plan for our lives. We need to be reminded and encouraged that he always works for good. And when we go through pain, we need to understand that if we are faithful, God can turn our lives around on a dime. Try to turn one of those freighters around out there in the river on a dime. Now, they've got side thrusters, mind you. They can move a little bit, and they can adjust. But they can't turn on a dime. God can turn us on a dime. And he turns us on a dime for his good. We can't figure out why bad things happen. Now, granted, we do bring some things on ourselves, and we wind up paying for the wrong we've done. That happens. But what about those times when we're innocent? And nothing that's happened to us should have. You remember the story that Bob told just at the beginning about Gerald Conk and his drowning? Here's the end of the story. 40 years later, that church is thriving. It is blessing the community. It's making a difference in that whole part of the state of Pennsylvania. And that 14-year-old boy wound up preaching there. He wound up preaching there. Because God works all things together for good to those who love him and those who are called according to his purpose. Listen to Isaiah. Beautiful passage that I know many of us have memorized. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 28 and following. Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. That means, Joseph, your imprisonment doesn't make sense, but God understands what it's going to bring about. He gives strength to the weary, and he increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary, and they will walk and not be faint. And so here's what it boils down to, folks. If you wait upon the Lord, and if you hope upon the Lord, someday, one day, you will mount up with wings like an eagle and fly again. It doesn't matter how bad the situation gets. What matters is that we follow a good God. And he helps us every moment of every day, on the condition that we yield ourselves to him. We yield ourselves to him. He won't help us if we simply thumb our nose at him and go about our own business. He will help us as we turn to him and trust in him, even when it doesn't make sense. It was Job who said, after facing all the tragedies of his life, none of them deserved, that he said, even if God slays me, kills me, I will still serve him. That's the attitude. And that's what makes a difference. You need that kind of difference in your life. Whatever tragedy you've faced, whatever difficulty, whether it's your own fault or it's someone else that's brought it on you, you need to be freed from that. And that comes from following Jesus Christ and yielding your life to him now and forevermore. Would you do that? If you're outside of the love and grace of Jesus, come to the one who's going to make sense of the mess you might find yourself in, and realize that all things work together for good to those who love God, for those who are called according to his purpose. Be called according to his purpose. You can make that kind of decision today. You can step forward and accept Christ as your Lord and Savior. Come and meet me up front as we stand and as we sing this song together. Let's stand.